Confined space awareness. Some areas of the workplace contain more hazards than others. Confined spaces are an example of these areas. A confined space is large enough for an employee to enter, has limited means of entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous occupancy. There are two types of confined spaces. If a confined space does not contain any safety hazards, it is considered a non-permit required confined space. If a space contains safety hazards, it is considered a permit required confined space and requires special safety precautions before entry can occur. Factors that can cause a space to be permit required include the size and configuration of the space, the volume and speed of air flowing through the space, the material stored in it, and the type of work being performed. Confined space entry permit. If entry is needed to the space, the employer must issue a signed entry permit. An entry permit is the written or printed document provided by the employer to allow and control entry into a permit-required space. Entry into a confined space occurs when any part of the body breaks the plane of an opening into the space. Permit-required confined space hazards. There are two categories of hazards associated with permit-required confined spaces: physical hazards and atmospheric hazards. Physical hazards pose direct, immediate danger to either the inside or outside of a worker's body. Common physical hazards include falls, materials falling into the space, configuration of the space, electrocution, engulfment, and stored materials. Atmospheric hazards affect air quality and present immediate health hazards. Acceptable atmospheric conditions must be verified before entering a confined space and must be continuously monitored while the space is occupied. The three conditions that must be measured are oxygen concentration, flammable or combustible material, and the presence of toxic gases. Oxygen content must be above 19.5% before work can begin. Oxygen deficiency is when the oxygen content is less than 19.5%. It is also important not to exceed an oxygen concentration of 23.5% offshore or 22% in shipyards. High levels of oxygen increase the risk of fire. The atmosphere must be tested for the presence of flammable or combustible materials. The lower explosive limit, LEL, is the lowest concentration of a material that will sustain a flame. Work cannot begin, or must be stopped, if the concentrations reach or exceed 10% of the LEL. To protect workers against exposure from airborne hazards, contaminants have permissible exposure limits, or PELs. PELs are mandatory limits on the amount or concentration of a particular material in the air. Toxins in the atmosphere are measured in parts per million, ppm. Some gases that are commonly monitored in the offshore and maritime industry are hydrogen sulfide and carbon monoxide. In confined space work, pre-job planning is critical. Pre-job planning ensures that employees understand the hazards, control measures, and safe entry procedures involved. Pre-job planning also includes procedures to follow in the event of an emergency. 4 levels of training apply to permit-required confined space entry. Entrants work in the confined space. Attendants monitor the entry. Supervisors authorize permits and oversee the operation. And rescue teams perform emergency rescue operations. Some common safe work practices and procedures in confined space work are using the buddy system and working in pairs, having a contingency plan in place for each potential emergency situation. All confined space participants must know the types of alarms, the response to each alarm, and the location of the muster stations. When the order to evacuate is given, time is of the essence. Isolating a confined space. Confined spaces must be isolated to restrict access. Barricades and lockout-tagout are the most common means of isolation. Soft barricades provide a visual warning, while hard barricades provide physical barriers to the area. Lockout-tagout is a 6-step energy control procedure that protects employees from unexpected equipment startup or the release of energy during confined space work. When atmospheric hazards exist, they are controlled by purging the space and by providing ventilation. Ventilation is categorized as natural or mechanical ventilation. Natural ventilation cannot be used when atmospheric hazards exist. Exhaust ventilation draws contaminants out of the space. Supply ventilation replaces the air in the space with air from a safe source. Additionally, the atmospheric conditions of the space are monitored throughout the entry. Electronic monitors are required when atmospheric hazards exist in a confined space. Confined space PPE. The hazards of a confined space may require entrants to use special PPE. Fall protection systems are often required when there is a potential for a fall of 4 feet or more. Respiratory protection is required when there are hazardous airborne contaminants or there is a lack of oxygen. Air purifying respirators filter out airborne contaminants, while supplied air respirators provide a continuous source of breathable air. It is vital to know how to use the required PPE properly. Working in confined spaces can present various hazards to workers. Conducting thorough pre-job planning, following all safety procedures and hazard controls, monitoring the space, and using all equipment properly all assist in keeping workers safe.